Thank you very much for having me. This is really wonderful. So what I'm going to talk about today, what we're doing at Vindolanda, it's impossible to get up in front of a room and talk about everything that's going on at Vindolanda because it really has exploded. I mean, everything that was found in the 70s and the 80s was amazing. But in the last sort of 10 or 15 years, a lot of what we're doing is really collaborating with pretty much anyone who comes to us and says, hey, I have a cool idea of something we can do with this material. It's a really great place, so hey, that's an invitation. If you've got an idea, graduate students, come on, talk to me. I'll send you off to the right people. We're really collaborating on a lot of different things. My little niche at Vindolanda right now is looking at leather. It's not really a little niche, actually. As you'll see, we've got about 8,000 pieces of leather. So it's, I guess, a big niche at Vindolanda in the museum there. So there's so much. You can probably already sort of start expanding your thoughts on where could you go with leather? Just about anywhere. I started looking at the shoes as people. Shoes saying, okay, who do these shoes represent? And that's where I started with the communities in the military, and that was some of the very best evidence coupled with the Vindolanda writing tablets, which are also there due to the anaerobic levels that I'm going to tell you all about here. But now I'm really interested in literally leather, just as a resource, as a material. Still the shoes though, but we're really trying to expand outward on everything that we're doing with this leather. So the collaborations that I have going on are quite interesting. So I'm going to start to tell you about just the site and the leather in case people don't have any background on that. Then I'm going to talk about some of the interesting work we're doing. We're going to jump to 3D imaging, then we're going to jump over to zooms analysis, and then we're going to jump into climate change. So there are a couple of different things we're going to do here. Oh, wait, I hit it again. It's going to go double. I think it's got a little lag. Okay, okay. No, we're good. Okay, so if you're not familiar with it, Vindolanda is up on the northern frontier in England. It is in the Hadrian's Wall kind of region. We don't say we're on Hadrian's Wall because we're not. We're about 1.5 miles south of Hadrian's Wall because we predate Hadrian's Wall by about 50 years or so. But we're up in that area. I imagine I don't think I've ever spoken to a room where somebody hasn't been there. So some of you, who's been there? Who's been to Vindolanda or been up to Hadrian's Wall? Oh yeah, right, okay, good. So we're all the way up there. Oh, which one is my, no. Which one is the pointer? Oh yeah, there we go. Yep, there we go, okay. So obviously Hadrian's Wall. If we jump over here and you're familiar with the modern map, Carlisle, Newcastle, Hexham is a lovely burg as well. We're kind of right there, right in the middle of the whole thing. But if we jump to the ancient map, you can see Vindolanda right here. I'm going to show this again because I'll jump over to Magna. But some of the other sites you may be familiar with are Housesteads, Corbridge, Chester's. Those are all places that you can go visit, and there are military forts. So we're very much on this military frontier. It seems to be only Vindolanda that has this extensive amount of anaerobic preservation and therefore all of the organic remains. There's certainly bits of leather from all of these sites. Housesteads has produced maybe about 500 pieces of leather, Bert Oswald as well. But it does seem that either because we're doing pretty continual excavation these days and have done for decades, or because it's just the special preservation that we have. But we do have the largest assemblage of organic materials generally. So when you walk onto site, you are looking at this. You come down, you buy your ticket sort of up here somewhere, and then you come down, and here we have the Vicus Road, we call it. You have the extramural or settlement or Vicus out here, and there is the fort right there. That's the 3rd century phase that you're looking at, 3rd century and onward. A lot of reworking of those upper levels into the 4th century. In fact, we have sub-Roman, post-Roman occupation. It looks like that occupation maybe goes through even the 6th or 7th centuries. We have a lot of evidence for Christianity in those late periods. But what I'm really interested in is what lies beneath. So here's your plan of the 3rd century right there. But what you can't see when you wander around are all of those large timber forts that are below the stones. Now, what you're looking at here is, are the images coming out okay? Yeah, the colors are coming out okay. You've got, there's that just for reference, that 3rd century stone fort. And then you have the very, very first fort practically directly underneath it, that blue that you can just see sticking out there. And then the next period, the 2-3 period, meaning 3 was a rebuild of 2. You've got that sort of reddish pink. And the very largest one we have is that big green fort right there. Those are all what we call our pre-Hadrianic forts. They all date before, about 120 and before, from about 85 CE until about 120. Now, that's important for the archaeology. This is an aerial shot of that extramural settlement outside of the fort and the disposition of the early layers down below. So if you're wondering, how do we get in there? We literally go between those walls. English Heritage does not want us to take those walls away, as you can imagine. So we have to kind of aquaprop them. It sort of reminds me of us in Santa Mobono, right? We're aquapropping things so that everything stays safe, and we have to kind of bounce down like that. And we get down into those very, very early layers. Now, when we're down there, it looks like this, when we start to really uncover large areas. Sometimes people say to me, wow, how do you keep stratigraphy clear? It's difficult. You have to work carefully. You have to work slowly. You also can't really, sieve this material. What you have to do is put large chunks up into wheelbarrows and literally sieve with your hands. You kind of just, because if you shove any of that stuff through a sieve, it's going to break up that soft organic material like a writing tablet that you are not interested in breaking up. Now, this picture right here is going to turn up. So what you're looking at here, I want to tell you about the kind of context and the kind of spaces where we find leather because we have that particular preservation down there. So there are two kind of major places. One are inside of structures, and that's what you're looking at here. So we have that's a period 4 structure, I believe, right there. And that's also a period 4. That's a period 4, the only kind of pre-Hadrianic that we have outside of the fort itself. And these are internal buildings right here. And what you're looking at, if you're thinking, I'm not really seeing it, it's kind of much clearer over here because we've got little white tags that mark each individual post. But over here, you can see a post here, 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 here. And then you start to piece it together, and you can actually see the wattle and daub walls. So we find in those spaces, we find leather, shoes, tent panels, objects, bags, every sort of thing that has been left behind probably in the latest levels of, the latest phases of occupation of those buildings. Though people do often say, really, do people have shoes hanging around for that long? And I say, well, have you looked in my mom's closet? Because she does have shoes that are like literally from the 60s. I'm not kidding you. So if they just up and moved and somebody demolished that house and then built over it, you would have shoes from the 1960s sitting right there. So yeah, we can debate about sort of when they were left behind. But the fact that they are left behind is on account of what we call anaerobic preservation. And this is going to come back up when we're talking about climate change and how it's affecting archaeology. So because these are oxygen-reduced environments, and because there's no oxygen getting into these spaces, we have no bacteria that's kind of thriving, living, and eating things like leather and wood and bone. And so we have all sorts of objects. Bone is rather robust, right? You can find these large bones sort of inside of any kind of space, but we have these like perfect bone, little tiny bone objects, little bone needles. Tons and tons of leather, lots of wood, the writing tablets, which I don't think I have a single writing tablet in this PowerPoint. The writing tablets are a great resource to kind of bring together with some of the other archaeology. And also metals. Metals come out with no corrosion. So you have no bronze disease. You have no rust. You have none of that. So that's also really exciting. So as Nick was saying, what you said before was a perfect segue into my very last slide, practically, which is the potential of these levels and why we don't want to lose them is pretty incredible. Which I imagine, you can imagine what the robusticity of the archaeological record when we have all this material. So no oxygen, anaerobic preservation of everything that was left there. The other place where we find a lot of material, and those are really exciting, I should have said, because of course it's the stuff that was left behind. It's the detritus of sort of daily life in these spaces. They don't seem to be leveling up fills. We have those fills above the sort of occupational fills, right? The occupational layers. But the other place that is sort of just thrown away, showing us a discard pattern, but also preserving things really, really well, are these fort ditches. And you see the excavation of a fort ditch right here. And I love this picture because you can really see the difference between ditch fill, sloping down. This is our big, big Severan ditch, which is absolutely massive. The ditches went around basically every fort. I don't know a fort that doesn't have a ditch outside of it. Sometimes one, sometimes three, sometimes five, or I think the greatest number we have, I think, is 7 somewhere. And these were defensive ditches, and people just kind of started using these as rubbish tips, essentially. They would just throw things away, particularly at the end of occupation. And I call this the abandonment horizon. You can very clearly see, if I jump to the next slide, you can very clearly see the fill of, it sort of seems a bit natural at the bottom. So you have your sort of just like standard bog growth with not too much human detritus in there. And then you get this line from here to here where it's just jam-packed full of everything. And then on top of it, that's where you get the proper fill. You get the actual leveling up, where there's the next people who are going to build, they're saying, okay, well, this subsidence is something awful. I don't know how they built over these things. You've got a whole bunch of stone and rubble, and then they build stone structures on top of that. So you're seeing the full profile there from the bottom of a ditch all the way up to the structures on top of that ditch. If we jump over to this image, that's a shoe sticking out, that's a bit of leather sticking out, that's leather, that's leather. This is all, these shoes are literally just sticking out of this one line of material from there. You can actually see the stratigraphy quite well right there, and then you can't see it quite as well here. About there is where the bog growth stops. So that to me says, okay, they're leaving the site. The military says, right, the government says you're going somewhere else. Somebody ships them out and they leave and they throw everything behind that they don't want to take with them. This is our Severan period ditch. Those ditches also became, because of all that stuff that's chucked on top there, sorry, right there, that also became either a semi-anaerobic or an anaerobic context, an environment. So again, thousands, literally thousands of shoes come out of these spaces. So that Severan ditch right there, if I just jump back to that picture, that excavation from there, from that wall to that wall, and then another little section over here produced in 2016, I think something like 470 some odd leather numbers, and 430 odd of those were shoes. So that also gives you the ratio of what that, so that results in a massive collection of Roman shoes. So when I set out, I don't know if you remember this, Nick, when I set out on my dissertation, somebody on the committee said to me, well, now, do you have a large enough sample size? And I was like, I think so, I think so. Now, what we have are nearly 8,000 leather object numbers. So the site database has 8,000 things that have been given this number. Now, we were just talking earlier about coin hoards. I have bags of leather that are all just these offcuts from one particular spot, this big or this big or this big, actually, that have one number. So in terms of pieces of leather, we literally have, I would guess, actually, 1 million, to be honest. Like, we have bags and bags and bags. So some of the bags that have one number actually have hundreds of pieces of little bits of leather here and there. Now, what can I get from that leather? It's tough to say, but if you bring the science in, a lot. So you're looking at our wall of shoes. If you've been to the Vindolanda Museum, you'll recognize this. You walk into the museum, you turn left, and there you are faced with this wall of shoes. And we did that on purpose at the museum because we wanted people to think about, we wanted visitors to think about the people at Vindolanda. Not the sort of bling, not the coins, not the armor and things like that. The people who lived at this site. And that is the point of the wall of shoes. It's also just really cool, right? Really, really cool. I love thinking about these shoes because you think, really, like that's somebody's actual footwear from nearly 2,000 years ago. I think that's a lot of fun. So nearly 5,000 of those 8,000 are shoes. Now, at the same time, I always have to point out that we don't have 5,000 shoes that look like this or this or this. We have 5,000 things that are categorized as shoes. Now, if it's shoe scrap, I do call it, I'm the one who records all of this leather. So if it's shoe scrap, then I will call it shoe scrap. If it is just shoe uppers, I'll call it shoe uppers. If it's a sole, I'll call it a shoe. So when you bring all of those things together, we have about 5,000 of those. I'm not done counting either, actually. But we have about 5,000 of those. Not all of those are usable. Did anyone catch the recent thing that went strangely viral about the Bigfoot shoes? Yeah, right? the headlines, archaeologists are perplexed. We were not perplexed. No one was perplexed by any of this. They were really cool, really, really cool. Don't mean to belittle the find. But in there, you may have noticed, it was such an archaeologist thing. Everyone's going, ooh, exciting. And then I'm like doing stats. I'm like, no, we don't have 5,000 measurable shoes because it was all about the size, So I think it's 3,704 shoes. You can actually know the size, understand if this, belonged to a sort of, make a guess at a man, woman, child, that kind of thing. So, but that's still a lot, right? We have lots and lots of shoes. So that's an exciting thing. Now, just to give you a sense of what else is available, we have a huge amount of leather. There's bags. That's actually a sort of pouch-like bag. That's half of it, I should say, that kind of cinches together. We have tent panels. So see how those right there? I'm going to talk about tent panels towards the end of this. That's one tent panel. We find those having come apart from the rest of the tent. We don't have thread, so we can talk about that later. We have little things like, that's a braided, decorative element. That's a little toy mouse. Anybody catch that? Mary Beard doesn't think that's a toy mouse. Anyway. And we also have manufacturing offcuts. That's one of those big bags of manufacturing offcuts that you can see has one number, L2004-70A. There's like hundreds of pieces of leather in there. So, lots and lots, and this is just a little corner of what is actually in the collection in that assemblage of leather. But it is the shoes that a lot of people come to Vindolanda for. They are super exciting. I'm writing a little public-facing book about the shoes right now, so if anybody is super interested, it's going to have a lot of great pictures. We have just this range of things, everything from small sort of adolescent shoes to large, very nice boots, shoes that have clearly been reused, the leather has been cut off so that somebody can probably reuse the leather later. There's all sorts of interesting stuff, and I right now have this team of PhD students who are working on all aspects of this. Some are looking at tanning and the actual leather, and some are looking at 3D imaging to figure out what we can do with it for understanding shoes and leather better, and some are looking at production. So there's going to be, I think, a lot more to be said about this in a couple of years once we start getting things out. Some of the shoes that over the years have really made a splash, you have something like this is a little adolescent, beautiful shoe with the kind of very nice, what we call the fishnet pattern, the cutout spaces, just some really, really stunning stuff. Now, of course, I am showing you the very, very best, but it's just a great collection to work with. So I'm really kind of serious if anybody has ideas, about what they could do with things moving forward. Come talk to me. So what are we doing with that? Let's talk about what we're doing with all of this leather. I'm going to talk about shoes and some 3D imaging, and then I'd like to talk about tent panels and some species analysis. So one of my PhD students is looking at using 3D imaging to, particularly 3D structured light scanning, in order to see the really shallow foot impressions that we cannot see with our eyes on the soles. Now, it's great that, when we have things like this, these are wonderful shoes to look at and to put on display, but actually, those are a bit of a pain in my ass because they have the uppers and I can't get to the insole, right? I can't get to that insole. So this is where our micro CT comes in because we can start to see through the thing. However, there's a lot of metal in these and you get a lot of feedback, right, on the micro CT. Anyway, it's another conversation. But what I'm really interested in, we have just hundreds, probably thousands of shoes that are really just this sole unit. And that's really exciting. And so what Maria and I started to talk about was, okay, hang on a minute. Is there something on those sole units that can tell us more about the foot that was actually wearing that shoe, that pressed into that shoe? Because when we wear, I've been wearing my Birkenstocks all summer, and you can see my foot in the Birkenstock, right? So we were kind of wondering, do we still have that sort of thing on 2,000-year-old shoes? And we can't see it, but could some form of imaging? And I'd be really interested to see if we want to try anything we possibly can. So what she started with was 3D structured light scanning, as you can see right here. And that was pretty successful. We got someplace with that. So the goals of that research, there were a couple of things. We had to kind of come up with, because I'm in a classics department, therefore she's in a classics department, so we had to come up with a sort of classics outcome, We couldn't just have a 3D imaging outcome, unfortunately. Let's all come together and get archaeology department so that we can just have a 3D imaging and archaeology PhD. But there are some really important questions about these shoes in terms of who's wearing them, because what we've worked with up until this point when we're thinking about ownership of a shoe is basically an overall length. You go from here to there on the insole, not the outer sole, and you have just sort of a grid. If it is under 19 centimeters, it is a child shoe. If it's between 19 and 21, it's a maybe female adolescent. You might be thinking what I'm thinking, which is that adolescent males grow through a female, right? So there's a lot of bioarc to be done here as well. And above 21 centimeters, and these are, by the way, I should say, with conserved shoes that do lose a little bit. They shrink a little bit, maybe 1 to 3%, not a ton. So these are measurements. You will see people talk about 24 centimeters being the upper limit of, if I use 24 centimeters at Vindolanda, like literally 60% of the site would be women. So that seems unlikely if we kind of throw this into our models of a military fort. So 21 centimeters, and then above that is the male range of footwear. But actually, just measuring from here to here is kind of a crude measurement, particularly looking at just these two shoes right here. The way that shoe is worn and the way that shoe is worn is very different. You've got a pointed, you've got a fashion change here, and that has a very, strong point on it. You can't possibly have your toes, although I've never really worn heels, but ladies who have, you can shove your toes down into those things, right? It can be quite uncomfortable. But that's exactly what we were wondering. What if we could see the foot impression on something like this? So that was one of our first points. Okay, can we get a much better sort of, can we refine how we measure the foot that was actually in this rather than just measuring top to bottom? And then also kind of related to that is how do we determine how certain types of Roman shoes were worn? So what you're looking at here, we've got the pointed shoes. So, all right, did the foot actually kind of end around here? Or were they wearing it right up into there? Or for here, did the foot actually come there? So we were really trying to understand things like, how was a sandal worn? Can anyone picture a Roman statue where the feet are sticking out, or a Greek statue, and the toes are kind of sticking over the sandal? So there is actually some indication that that is the way they wore sandals. It seems so enormously uncomfortable to me, but hey, who knows, maybe. That's what we were trying to get at. And then also what Maria is trying to do generally is to provide recommendations to help smaller museums, smaller sites. In the UK, there are all sorts of community projects that really don't have access to something like 3D imaging, or, now kind of everyone has certain access to 3D imaging, right? But, maybe they don't have the skill, or they don't have the money, or they don't have the feasibility, or they don't have the expertise. So what we're trying to do is provide recommendations. Say, okay, this type of shoe, if you're trying to understand the owner of that shoe, you need to take off a centimeter. You need to, in terms of the size, who that represents. So that's something that's going on. So those are the kind of goals of this research. Okay, now this slide is the one, if you care about all this stuff, about dimples and Lambertian radiance scaling, take out your phone, photograph this slide, and we move on. This is not my specialty. Maria would love to talk about this for at least 10 minutes, but not what I'm going to do. I'm going to jump to the results of these case studies. They're pretty interesting. I would have loved to have seen, like, bam, there's the foot, just like you can see the footprint. But if you start to really get into various kind of elements here, and actually, let me just check out this light. It's not working super well on here, which is always the case, right, with presentations. But if we had this, if you're looking on our screens, you get a lot more of these sort of individual toe impressions in here. And one thing we realized is that, in fact, they are wearing these pointed shoes a little bit sort of further up into that toe than I would have thought. So in terms of thinking about the foot that wore that and who we can think about in sort of the demography of the site, who are we talking about wearing that shoe? So there is a certain amount of residual impression there that can be picked up. There's another thing, another offshoot of this that was quite interesting for us. And, oh, you know what? You can't really see it. Oh, my goodness. So this is really crazy. You can't really see it. Right in here, there's actually an inscription. It says VIII. And that came out simply with the 3D structured light scanning. You couldn't see it before. So it's also bringing out little details, impressions of stamps. You've got decorative stamps on here that you can actually kind of see better on that image. But what we realized was that all of a sudden, you've got other things that are popping out on these shoes with 3D imaging. So that was exciting as well. And what Maria is pointing out too is that you can kind of see some of the impressions. So there is a notion that, and this is a sandal that you're looking at right here. There is a notion that they are wearing these shoes kind of over, their toes are kind of coming over the top of the shoe. So maybe in that case, in the case of sandals, we need to actually add maybe half a centimeter or a little bit, or at least really take that size of the insole for, as truth, as that's the kind of size of the individual who wore that shoe. And then if we jump to something like this, we've got, you can kind of make out, and we've drawn that to sort of give you a better idea. You can kind of make out the impression of the foot. And again, on a sandal, pushing right up to the end there. You can see the various impressions on the lateral side. The waist is this middle part. On the insole, you can see the lateral seat. So it seems as though this individual really pushed out. So the other question is, we do work with bioarchaeologists and anthropologists who are looking at, can we start talking about sort of health outcomes? Are we seeing how these shoes are being pushed upon? Did people pronate, supinate, all this kind of stuff? So that's something else that's going to hopefully come out of this if I can get the right people onto the project. There were some challenges as well. We have a lot of shoes that were found in the 1970s that are preserved with what we call PEG. It's this sort of carbo wax thing. Really horrible. Do you have anything in your collections? Did they do this in Italy? Did they use PEG? It's really horrible stuff. And it basically makes, yeah, you're probably thinking. Oh, it's horrendous. Yes, absolutely. The peg-treated shoes are like hockey pucks now. And they're in fact for this, for structured light scanning, it's too shiny. It actually just gets too much reflection. They do, they plump up, yeah. It's, we don't have the capacity to freeze dry, so yeah.
But like these may be good for freezing and freeze drying. The 70s treated.
Right, maybe. We'll talk about it after. Yeah, there's a lot to be said there. So some of these that had the early conservation, you can't really do the structured light scanning. It's just not working on it at all. If you have a lot of surface damage as well, that's kind of to be expected. But we were sort of half hoping, well, maybe with things that are not in very good shape, maybe the 3D imaging really bring it out. But it kind of obscures it quite a bit. And then highly decorative insoles, sort of things got in the way a little bit as well there, which is sort of interesting. That's something I want to think about more, actually. You wouldn't really think it would get in the way, but it might also be that those insoles weren't worn a lot. So that's the other thing. If something hasn't been worn a lot, it's not going to have a deep impression. We might not be seeing it, which is what we found with children's shoes. Almost none of the children's shoes have any kind of impression there at all. They're small, they're light, and they don't wear shoes for a long time. So it might be as simple as that. So moving on, I want to talk about a lot of things today. So I want to move on to thinking about other kinds of leather. So that's one of the main things we're doing with shoes. But like I said, I'm really interested now in leather, sort of as a material, and trying to understand what that will tell us about life in the military, life in the provinces, life in the Roman world generally. So production and consumption of leather, I think, is really based on species analysis. And that's where we're going with a lot of the work that we're doing right now. I just have to show my thanks to everyone that I work with. Jillian Taylor at Teesside, Rhiannon Stevens at UCL, Barbara Burley from the Vindolanda Trust, the curator there, and Matthew Greene, who's at North Carolina State. This is a team of people who are looking at genomics, at paleoproteomics. Jillian is an analytical chemist, so there's a lot going into this that is certainly not all me. So when we're distinguishing types of leather, when we're thinking about species, and you might be thinking, well, why does it matter? A lot, right? We are going to think about trade and movement and economy and how you're getting all of this leather to move around the empire, and where is it moving from, and are we relying on local economies? These are the questions that we're going to be asking. Now, before about 2005, which is when paleoproteomics sort of hit the scene with a guy called Matthew Collins, who seems to be sort of the grandfather of all of this, you used to look at the follicle pattern, and that's what you're seeing here on the images below the animal. The follicle pattern supposedly looks different for different kinds of animals. This maybe gets a little bit obscured with 2,000-year-old leather, but people thought that they could do this fairly well anyway. I did a course in Northampton on traditional leather working, and we did a day on follicle analysis, and I walked away going, come on, no way. It just was so, and even some of the things that, you've got your little key over here and you know that this is deer and this is cow and this is, and I would go over here and she would have the key and know which one, and they didn't match up. I said, but they look so different. Oh yeah, sometimes it doesn't work. So up until about 2005, that was how you did it. You kind of said, okay, look at the follicle pattern, look at the general thickness, and there was pretty much a guess about what was going on here. And that sort of led us to say, hang on, there's got to be something more we can do here. So our guiding questions, we have guiding questions, then we had very specific things that we were looking at. So we wanted to know, first we were looking at tents, and you'll understand why we wanted to look at tents in a minute. But our first thing was sort of, do species choice for tents and really any other objects, does it change through the different occupation periods? Does it change in different places? Is there a shift in the type of leather that's being used, therefore the type of economy, agricultural practices, are things shifting through time? We wanted to know if specific animal hides were used for very specific objects. So did they have a purpose? Did you always use this kind of hide for this kind of object? Or are they using whatever is accessible? Because that, I think also, I've got questions about that. Did people know? Did your average person who was working with leather absolutely know what kind of hide they were working with once it kind of came to them, tanned and finished? Some probably did. Maybe somebody didn't. I don't know. Maybe they all did. Maybe this was all very clear. And then the further question, the further sort of guiding question is, do we need to reevaluate the supply of the Roman army? Because all of this, of course, is happening at Vindolanda, so we're looking at that sort of military context out there in the frontier. So do we need to reevaluate what happens there? But we then also, we're going to use Zoom, zooarchaeology by mass spectrometry. That is going to be very clear. It's going to tell you everything that you need to know. So we could really kind of come down on some very specific questions. We wanted to apply this process to Roman tent panels, first of all, to confirm the hide type used in manufacture. And I'll tell you why in just 1 minute. We wanted to test also manufacturing offcuts, that was our second thing, to determine the primary animal types that were used in leather production at the site. So what kind of hides were coming in and being used to actually make objects at Vindolanda. And then we also wanted to examine shoes to determine if different leather species, different types were used in different parts of a shoe or in different shoes. Do we have, nicer shoes, are utilizing one leather, et cetera, et cetera. So those were our three main questions. Now, returning to the tents, starting with the tents. What do we know about Roman tents? So it had been presumed, basically, since the sort of 80s, 90s, so before proteomics, so no one's to blame here, that they were made of goat. And everybody's very certain about them being made of goat. And so Jillian and I sort of went, why are we so certain about those being made of goat? That's really interesting. And this kind of went to such a level that people were, Carol Vandrell Murray, wonderful person. I work with her a lot. She's fantastic. She suggested in 2000 that a single legion needed 68,000. So one legion of 5,000 would need 68,000 goats for tents alone every year. And then Willy Groneman van Wateringa took that a little bit further, and she estimates that they would need nearly 3 million goat hides. 3 million hides for the military, all of the military. It's a little unclear to me if that was also including the auxilia. It's unclear to me whether that was for all of the equipment and the shoes. We've got some questions here. But those are huge numbers, absolutely huge numbers. And then Willy, she took it to the next level and sort of saying, okay, well, if the military needs that many hides, how do you get those hides from, if they're goats, and they were all certain they were goats, how do you get those goat hides from the kind of major goat producing areas? Because of course, all you have to do is walk around Britain for 5 minutes and say, there aren't many goats here. This is kind of sheep country. And so the question was, how do we get, so sort of North Africa and the Near East, Western Asia, that's all very much goat country. So then the economic models are being written up that, okay, this is what you have to do to get all of those goat skins all across the empire here and there and elsewhere. And then other people chimed in, and I think it's Whitaker just sort of says, oh, they would need 120,000 cow hides. I don't know where that came from, but another sort of, so we were sort of wondering, is any of this true? Is this a real calculation? And then also, what kind of clarification can scientific processes bring into this, right? And they certainly can at this point. So we started testing. Luckily, Vindolanda is the one place where you can go and get your hands on literally hundreds of tent panels. I mean, frankly, I'd rather have thousands of tent panels to like really prove this, and I'd rather have thousands of tent panels from 4 other sites from across the empire, and we don't have that, unfortunately. But hundreds of tent panels was a great place to start. So what we did, we sampled 102 tent panels from Vindolanda with the question, are these going to be goat? Are they going to be sheep? Are they going to be cow? That's kind of what they look like, some range of those objects. We sample from right underneath the hem. So all tent, not every tent panel, but most tent panels have this little hem that comes over. That's like tiny. That's way zoomed in. And the reason we did that so that you would have the least amount of contamination in there. You wouldn't have sort of human hand contamination, things like that. But of course, you know, if the human protein came up, we're assuming this isn't made of human skin. Oh, who knows though? We'd have to do some new testing, hey? But you actually pull a fiber. That's the other thing. Vindolanda has so much leather that it's absolutely fine to go under this hem and actually pull a fiber out, but it's really microscopic. You can't, the object isn't affected at all. So you grab a fiber, actually make sure that it is something that was attached and isn't just a little piece of dirt that kind of fell off of it, right? Some people say, oh, well, couldn't you just shake it? But then you really have no idea, right, where that actually came from. So you actually pull a little fiber. You put it into your little test tube. You have to do a number of things. I actually spent a day in the lab doing this, and I was like, no, thank you. Has anybody pipetted all day? Oh, my God. Lord, no thanks. It was a long day, but the results are worth it. The results are definitely worth it. But it's, there's a lot of work that goes into it. So when we got the results back on our 102 tent panels, the big question, as you know, are these goat? Is that what we're looking at? Now, following this, again, I'm not the scientist, right? But I know enough that all of these numbers are very meaningful. And it's actually quite fun. I mean, you literally, this is called a Multitoff, is the machine that's doing this. And when you take this and you pop, everything goes onto here on a bunch of these, and you pop that into the machine, and then you sit in front of this screen with your popcorn, and things and numbers are just like flying around. And if you see like 1208, boom, cow, that's what it is. So you're just watching all these things because all these animals have all these different things, but animals have one specific, right? So I think it's 1208 is the very specific cow peptide. And I think it's 3033 is the sheep peptide. And so you're watching for this, and when it pops up, you're like, woo! Like, it's, you know, whatever it is you're looking for or not looking for. It's really fun. And then the real work happens. The people who actually analyze all this, which actually now AI is going to do for us, wonderful. Because this takes weeks and months to kind of stick this all in. You can write an R code that will do this. And now I think you can just have AI write your R code, and so it's going to go a lot faster now. Okay, so what did we find? I don't need that. We found that of all of the tents, we have, don't you love my little symbols? Did anybody see my AA poster 2 years ago with these symbols all over it, right? I love, so much fun. So we found that there are no goats. Big old red X, there are no goats. Not a single tent at Vindolanda is a goat. So I find that really fun. I mean, I think I remember Nick very clearly in the beginning of graduate school saying, what you have to do is take a brick out of the wall of somebody else and put your own brick in. And that's what I feel like I'm doing. So nope, they're not goats. Now, and you might say, okay, fine, so they're sheep instead of goats. So what we have is, we have a couple of tents from our period 1 ditch, so the very first period at Vindolanda. We have 8 really beautifully preserved tent panels. 4 of them sheep, 4 of them cow. So that's interesting, because nobody's ever talked about tents being made of cow, but there's only 4. And then from period 2 through 7, so 94 more, 100% sheepskin. So basically, Roman tents, other than those 4 in the first period, and we're going to keep doing, we're going to do more batches. We've got another couple hundred that we can do, and see what happens. But as of right now, we're looking at 0 goat. In fact, we have almost no goat on the site at all. We finally found 2 shoes that the uppers are goat. So interesting. So what I find really great about this is that, you might want to say, well, okay, fine, so they're sheep and not goat, Are they roughly the same size? And actually, they're not, weirdly. I thought, well, sure, they're probably about the same size. But no, apparently a sheep can be much larger. So that's interesting. That makes sense. I've always thought, well, yeah, if you could use cow. But then the Roman army really needs to think about things like weight, right? You can't carry a tent around that weighs twice as much as, if you use a different kind of skin. It really matters. And then when we really think about the economy and the agricultural practices and the human labor and everything that goes into that, from tanning to trade. That is the name I came up with yesterday for my grant that I just submitted last night. From tanning to trade. That is an incredible amount of labor and animals and humans and a lot happening in between. So in fact, knowing what kind of animals these tents are made out of is actually pretty important. If we're going to start, if we're talking about the economy of the Roman military or the economy of the Roman world, right? So that's pretty cool. So if we jump back to that same slide where we've got all of these calculations and then how do you get all these goat skins? Well, maybe you don't need to get the goat skins very far. Maybe you're relying on, so maybe all the tents, if I had hundreds of tents from sites in North Africa, maybe they would be goatskin, or in the near, somewhere at Dura Europus, maybe they would be goatskin. But at Vindolanda and in the Northwest, they don't seem to be goatskin. So we're waiting on a grant application right now in the UK, thank God. Yeah, right. If we get the money, then we're partnering, we're collaborating with the National Museum of Scotland, with the Rijksmuseum van Uden in Leiden. Hopefully we can get some London folks on board. So we will be testing more. We have done a bunch of testing in Leiden already, and we're working on those results right now. So we're really hoping to expand this out, and in the end, I would love to involve absolutely everybody in the whole Roman Empire that has leather. So it would be fantastic. We just need the AHRC to come through with a couple million pounds. That would be really great. So it's a really exciting project. This is a lot of fun to think about, what the possibilities are of material like this. So we're not really stopping there. It's not just tents for us. We are also looking at other kinds of objects. So what's up with production in the military context? What else is going on? And when we tested those manufacturing offcuts, because we have also done that, we jumped into, rather than jumping and just getting a few samples from every period, meaning sort of 85 to about sort of 270-ish, 250, something like that, we just focused right in on one period for these manufacturing offcuts. So we thought, well, let's get a profile of one period. So we grabbed manufacturing offcuts from a couple of different areas, a couple of different find spots from period 6B. That's our Severan, our early 3rd century. And that came back 100% manufacturing offcuts cow. So we have a lot more work to do here because we need to really get the profiles of all the different occupation periods, which thank goodness at Vindolanda are really quite clear. There might be some, there's going to be something that's not going to work in there, but they're really quite clear, like this 3rd century ditch versus a 1st century structure is very different, and it's very clear what that is. So all of the offcuts from this period, so everything that's being produced, so the hides that are coming in and there and being worked at Vindolanda in that period are all cow. So are we seeing some sort of economic shift? Are we seeing some reliance, let's say, on local, regional economies at one point, and that's shifting? We have to, and is that local economy shifting? Is that other agricultural practices shifting? There's a lot of questions here, and have me back in like 5 years, and I'll try to answer some of them. I'm also really interested in this one. I love this. Testing the different parts of a shoe. So shoes have all sorts of different sections to them. They have a outer sole, which is what you see out here, down there with the studs. That's a metal stud in it. They have an insole, which is the uppermost part. They have midsole layers, everything in between. They have internal thonging, all of those little stitching things that you're seeing there. They have the uppers, so all of this business. You've got some bits of uppers on there, you can see. They've got something called the heel stiffener, which is this bit right here, which is its own separate piece. They have laces, which I didn't put the picture of the laces. There are all sorts of different parts of a shoe, and I was really curious, do you use the same hunk of leather, or do you think, well, laces should be this other kind of thing, And again, back to, do they know what they're working with always? We also found, we did, again, just a profile period, and this is where we really need to get some postdocs into, if we get this grant, we need them to test like hundreds of shoes, right? We need to take lots and lots of shoes. So we did 4. This was just our initial, okay, let's see if this works. Let's see what happens here. We did 4 shoes. 3 were viable samples. They're all from period 6B again, that early 3rd century. And all components were manufactured from cowhide on those 3 shoes. So everything from the laces, the thongs, the soles, the uppers, everything. That's interesting still in itself, just sort of as an initial because it has been said a lot that, oh, they probably would have had sort of a fancier upper, something thinner, something more supple. So you've got your thick cowhides on the soles, and then you'll have maybe deer hide. I would love to find deer hide. I want to find some exotic thing. I want that to pop up. I don't know what the peptide number is on that. So it would be really interesting, but so far what we have is a bunch of cow, which is, it makes sense. We also need to do different kinds of shoes. So we did actually, I was photographing everything on display in January. So the Vindolanda Museum closes in January to the public, and you can do what you wish with the display items. So I photographed everything, and as I was photographing, Jillian was behind me sampling everything. So we actually have found on some, and the nicest shoes, of course, are the ones that are on display. We have found in 2 adolescent shoes, the uppers are goat. So 2 sort of children's shoes, children to adolescent. That's kind of interesting. But we are still evaluating that material, so we'll see what pops up next. So if I have enough time, how's the time doing? Yeah, good. We'll just be a little realistic. Maybe I don't want to leave everyone on a sad note, but I'll end on some nice slides. So because we're talking about organic material, it's also important to talk about these environments that are shifting and changing, and whether we're still going to have them in 10 or 20 or 50 or 100 years. So we do have a problem at Vindolanda, which is that there are extreme weather events that are happening. Anecdotally, the shoes and the leather that comes out and wood and things, we used to find textile, I wasn't around. They used to find textiles back in the 70s and 80s. We never find textiles anymore. And so it's just sort of anecdotal observation. The leather doesn't seem to be as well preserved. The shoes don't seem to be as well preserved from similar kinds of contexts. Now, of course, we don't have the record of the pH levels, let's say, of the soil from the 1970s and 80s. But they're the same kind of anaerobic fort ditch, let's say, or surrounded by the same kind of woods and the same kind of things leaching into. So, it's not a slam dunk, but there's some interesting things going on. Now, for some of this monitoring and climate change questions that we're asking, we're down here at Magna as well. So Vindolanda also operates a museum called the Roman Army Museum, and it's on a site called Magna, also known as Carvorin. And they've got a 5-year Heritage Lottery grant right now that is all wrapped up with monitoring, understanding what climate change is doing to the soil underground. So the first thing that was done, a bunch of boreholes were dropped. So this is the site of Magna. You have a fort over here. That's the modern, that's the museum and everything. One of the things that was, again, a sort of anecdotal observation was that back, even in 2001, there's a big bog here. So there's a whole bunch of peat in this field. And of course, you've probably heard that our peat bogs are shrinking all over the world. And that's a real problem for carbon intake, and that they would suck in the carbon. So our little peat bog out here in 2001 was about the size of that. And now in 1920 is about the size of that. So that's shrinking quite dramatically. So that was something that, Andy Burley, for instance, who grew up on this site here, he would walk across, and when he was a kid, he really couldn't walk across any of that. And now it's all dry, and he can just walk across it, and there's just this sort of smaller area. Also, the archaeological remains appear to be rising out of the ground, which of course they're not. The ground around them is sinking. And so features are appearing all over the place. That's really interesting as well. So Magna became the spot that everyone was going to look, and they dropped a bunch of boreholes in all of these different areas. And there's boreholes at Vindolanda as well that are monitored It looks like Santa Mobono. Remember all that fun stuff? And you had some of my Western students on that. That was fun. I just was with Rob the other day, and he brought it up. He was like, oh, best summer of my life. So there's one of the monitoring stations at Vindolanda. So they drop the borehole, they get the core out, which is also interesting. I'm not going to talk about that now. But then they drop the probe down, and that's monitoring. And what's above ground is this right here. So we have, I think, 3 or 4 of these at Vindolanda, and there's a bunch at Magna as well. And it's measuring everything from pH and conductivity and all of this interesting stuff. Now, that has also since been coupled, I think a year later, with an actual weather station to understand how the weather is then maybe affecting what's down below. So you've got wind speed and direction and rainfall and all of these different things going on. Now, what became really, really interesting, so you've got things like pH and conductivity, but what became really interesting is redox, and that is whether you have this reducing environment or you have an oxidizing environment. So an oxidizing environment, of course, brings in all of that air, that oxygen, that we don't want in these anaerobic layers, right? So that turned out to be something really interesting. One of the things we're looking at here is the other sort of anecdotal observation was that the wooden posts, what they're doing is they're shrinking. So they used to take up the whole space of where, so we actually we don't have just post holes, we have the actual wooden posts, and they have tucked right up to the clay and the soil around them. Well now, because we're having these massive events, dry events, followed by really massive climatic events like deep, deep rain, heavy rain for a couple of days, but after 2 weeks or 2 months or 3 months of dry, so when it's super dry, those posts are shrinking down now. And then you've got air all around them. So it's actually introducing these air pockets that then can go down. So then when the rain hits, it goes down into what used to be anaerobic. And what we're finding is that it's shifting from the environments below the ground are shifting from aerobic to anaerobic and back to aerobic. So it's very volatile. It's not good for the archaeology. It's not good for leather. It's not good for wood or anything. So that is kind of a massive problem. So one of the questions is, what can we do about this? Now the leather comes back into this because Jillian and I said, well, we have the benefit at Vindolanda of having 5 to 6 decades of leather that has come out of the ground since the early 70s, basically. So we decided, we did a whole bunch of testing. We did FTIR, which don't ask me what that even is. But we came down on this, the SEM, the scanning electron microscope, that was really telling us something interesting when we looked closely at the collagen inside of the leather structure, basically. So our sampling strategy was this, and we do need to expand this, but our sort of initial, because a lot of this, we're just saying, is this going to work? Are we going to get any kind of result off this? So we took 6 samples from, I actually found this box of leather just in the back of a closet that said, unconserved leather from 1972. I was like, well, thanks for the label, mate, because that was really good, So we had unconserved, because that's also a question, what does the conservation do to it? Now, of course, we can pull anything out of the ground and test, do all sorts of things about pre-conservation, post-conservation. And we do that actually with all of the Magna leather, so that's fun. So unconserved, 6. We had 1970s conserved leather, 1985 with chemical conservation, 94, 2004, 2014, 2023, because we did this in 2023, all with chemical conservation. And we were looking at the collagen structure. We were looking at the structure of the leather to see if this had broken down at all. Now, like I said before, we can't know what the pH levels or what was going on in the soil from the 70s and 80s, but we did our very best to choose samples from the same, we did a variety of things, manufacturing offcuts, things that had been part of objects, but we were trying to compare like with like. So they came from the same kinds of context. So we do have all the contextual records, which is great for the stuff from the 70s and 80s and 90s. And we would at least know, okay, these came from the bottom layer of a ditch or something like that. So again, we can't know exactly what was going on with the soil then. Now we do. Now there was a PhD at Teesside working with Jillian who actually looked at all of the soil, not the leather itself, but the soil around it. So that's some interesting stuff as well. But we used different kinds of archaeological contexts so that we could compare things from similar contexts in different periods. And what we end up seeing here is from the 1970s, you have a much more tightly bound structure. These large bonded collagen fibrils called fibrils, and they are healthy, basically, in the 1970s. And then when we jump just up to the 2010s, you have a great loss of structure, poor stability, you've got a breakdown of these collagen fibers. It isn't, they are not preserved as well. Now again, you always have to think about if this was something that was sitting in, just a semi-anaerobic top of a ditch, it had seen a lot of oxygen, it had seen a lot of air, then you can't compare these two. So that's why we were really trying, and still, this isn't a slam dunk, but it's an indication that maybe, if we zoom in on this, you can see that even more, where you've got these nice, healthy collagen fibrils here, and here it's just a mess of little bits, and that's it's breaking up, it's falling apart. So leather does seem to be in not so good shape as it was 40 or 50 years ago. Now, let me just end on a couple of things. So I don't think I have to tell this room why do organic artifacts matter. I think you're probably well aware why these matter and what the potential of these artifacts are. But just to really bring that home, this is, I showed you that in the beginning. That's that period it's the extramural. It's the only extramural occupation that we have in any of the pre-Hadrianics. So this is our only glimpse to see what people outside of the fort are living like and what they're doing. If we did not have the organics, so we'd be, lucky if we had the post holes, so we might have a little bit more of the actual structure and what it looked like. But if we didn't have the post holes, now in reality this is clay, so we probably would have post holes, but if you didn't have any of these organics, you'd be left with a very, very typical, this looks like any old assemblage of material from any site in the Roman period in Britain, where you have game counters, ligulous needles, studs, brooches, bone-handled knives, writing implements, pottery, beads, rings, bracelets, all sort of what we would call a Romano-British, 1st to 2nd century kind of assemblage. The only thing a little bit off was this beehive quern, which is very much an Iron Age style, a very local, regional style of quern. And then you have your very Roman disc quern over here, which, if you look over there, the disc quern is sitting in the rectilinear house, and the beehive quern is in the round house, which I find very... Has anyone read the AAA article, the AJ article from January 2024, me and Andy Burley? It's quite interesting. It's about this space. And the first iteration of this was the round house and the square house, because we learn, the Brits liked the round houses, and the Romans came along and built the square houses. So if we add in all the organics, that's what we're looking at. That is just a much fuller picture. You've got all of the wattle and daub. You've got construction styles. I'm realizing that in these early periods, they are actually using leather in wall construction as a construction material, not just, so padding it, maybe it's a damp course, maybe it's for insulation. We have wooden combs, and we have tons and tons of animal bone. We have a hoard of hazelnuts. We have all sorts of super interesting stuff that we absolutely would not have without the organic artifacts. Otherwise, we're just looking at, the typical pottery, brooches, and bronze needles and that sort of stuff. So if you're interested in this, and you're thinking, I could really use that image right there, that is where it is published. Barbara and I, who's the curator at Vindolanda, it's fully open access, so just Google the Limes Congress from 2022, and you'll get it. It's on Sidestone. It's fully available. But if you need any of these images, just give me a shout. I'm happy to share them. Anyone, I'm not going to charge you or anything. So what we really have to ask ourselves is, buried archaeology safe? Is it that old idea of, let's leave half the site so that future generations and science will be better and everything? Surely we can still think that way, but I don't think we can with organic artifacts, with sites that have all of this organic, the anaerobic environments are not going to last forever, and we're going to lose a lot of material. So is it safe? I don't know. Do we want to leave these? Are we going to move into some sort of emergency excavation kind of rescue excavation mode? Are we going to do it when it's too late and we can't possibly save all of this stuff? Hard to say. But we're monitoring, and we're trying to get some good data to take to policy makers and people who can maybe do something about it. So informing excavation strategy, hopefully, is what some of this will do. Thank you very much. I just have a thank you slide and an acknowledgement slide. So those are all the people that fund me and the people that I work with and all sorts. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so very much, Beth. This was wonderful, as well as, you know, a source of concern. And especially, you know, if, like most of us, you're an archaeologist who works in a temperate zone, there are a few things more depressing than going to see, on the one hand, a place like Kozma, where you have, you know, like mats just sticking out of the soil, and wooden spoons,
Wild.
you know, everywhere.
Yeah.
Or Vindolanda, where you see mostly in the museum this kind of stuff, and you realize how much is missing in the middle. But now, if even these blessed sites where the preservation used to be so amazing are now under threat, this kind of changes the equation. So thank you so much. I'm sure there are questions. And I have a mic. Yes. Thank you, Susanna.
This is maybe not a question, but I just want to note that temperature also affects the preservation. So it's not just that you're losing your anaerobic environment or that it's becoming like semi-aerobic and like you're losing the water. It's also probably getting hotter.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think I've ever called Britain hot on any given day in the middle of July, but
But
yeah,
but
it's
like
warming up. It's
the
warming
really
up.
like best preservation comes with low oxygen and low temperature. So as the temperature rises and you're introducing oxygen and you have these like wet, dry cycles, it's
Yeah.
just like all getting
Yeah,
worse.
and it's the
like-
volatility, right? It's the up and down. It's the, if we have months, and you might be thinking, God, last time I was in the UK, it rained every day. But this is the problem, that it's not an even kind of sustained temperature or rainfall. It's the intense periods of dry followed by intense periods of wet. And that's just really making it go up and down and up and down.
I guess I do have a question too about tent panels. And do you have them from Egypt? Like, are there
No.
Roman
So
Egyptian tent panels?
So here is, the situation with tent panels. Most of the leather that we have really does come from the Northwest Empire. So Netherlands, Britain, some in Germany. We do have some leather from Dura. So I was actually just out in the spring looking at some of the Dura shoes. They have one piece that I think could be a tent panel. They're not letting me do any scientific testing right now. They are kind of no on that. So that's out at Yale. And Precarious, I'm going to be in the Kelsey tomorrow, but you guys have mostly like the shoes are palm fiber. There's not a lot of leather, right? But I think I'm going to see some leather tomorrow. But there's nowhere else do we have, other than in the Northwest, do we have even dozens of tent panels that we can test. So this is one of the problems. Vindolanda has always sort of stood alone up there, and we don't have another assemblage to compare shoes or tablets or, really, which is a shame.
Hi. This was super interesting, and I have so many questions, but I'm going to ask two kind of entangled questions.
Okay.
So you were sort of pushing in the direction of talking about trade and what, for example, like the animal remains can tell us. So I'm interested in like just getting you to talk more about how maybe the kind of evidence you're working with has changed our understanding of how trade is being conducted through conduits like that are part of the Roman army.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
but can I ask a follow-up?
Yeah,
okay.
totally.
And so then the other thing I was thinking about, like the shoes are just so phenomenal, and they're phenomenal for teaching it. They're so amazing. And obviously the question of style comes up, and I'm excited
great.
to hear about, I'm coming to dinner with
Yeah,
you.
I have a zero memory. So let me do
Okay.
the first
Okay.
question. I will
Okay.
never remember two questions.
Okay.
So the first question, in terms of, I think we want to think more about like economy of the military and how we have so much more work to do though. Right now, we've got all of these really interesting glimpses going, wow, okay. So there's so much, you can't make a whole argument on 102 10 panels and whatnot. So there's a lot more that's going to happen in the next 5 years for sure. But what I'm thinking is that what we need to really, first of all, kind of lose the old idea of maybe goat skins traveling across the whole empire, right? So we're done with that. But are they coming in, let's say, are they relying in Britain on the local economy, let's say in the late 1st century? And then are we going to see that shift? So once we can get in there and really test everything, or enough from each occupation period, way more manufacturing offcuts, way more of the shoes. But the shoes, finished products, we can't really say. That's why it's really great that we do have the spaces of manufacturing with the tools and the offcuts, because that is like, boom, that's where they were working leather. We have a couple of spaces like that, but then we also have these dumps of the offcuts into a ditch. So at least that's kind of representing, and offcuts are really easy to tell what they are. So I think what we're going to start to see is potentially, or maybe a hypothesis or a question to ask is, are they relying on a sort of local resource when they first get there, and then you start to work into these much broader sort of military roots and patterns of economy and trade? Or is it actually going to be the opposite? Do they have to get in there and at first they're really just relying on themselves, and then we're going to see a shift into something that could be more local? Now, we also need the 5th person that I mentioned at North Carolina State, Matthew Greene. He's the genomics guy. So he's going to bring in a whole nother set of questions, which is sex of the animals. So we're thinking about sort of agricultural practices, sex of the animals, and then if we could get actually down to breed, location. We can also probably tap into some of the bone studies that have been done, animal bone studies across the empire, and where those animals are coming from. Now, a lot of people say, well, why don't you do this with the Vindolanda bones? But there is literally no connection between the Vindolanda bones and the Vindolanda leather. We can't say that those ever went together. They might have, but we can't make any connection right now. So there's a lot more work that needs to be done with that. Yeah. Yeah.
So that's so super interesting, and that does really dovetail with the other thing I wanted to ask, which was about style. And that, if we think about Vindolanda as being a place where there are people from all over the Roman Empire hanging out, but maybe also locals and a local economy, perhaps.
Right.
Do you see, what can you tell about the community and the sociality and the culture of Vindolanda from the styles of the shoes?
Sure. So styles, it's funny because people always ask me, do you really like shoes? Is it about style for you? And it is not about style and fashion, right? I've got a colleague that does fashion and she's so interested. But in fact, it is very interesting, and I have to admit to myself that I actually do find this kind of interesting. So one of the things I've done with styles, we can absolutely track some of the very sort of higher end shoes, like that elite, fishnet style, which is only found basically, for the most part, there's it right there, that one right there. That style with the fishnet is only found inside of the Praetorium for the most part, in these kind of high-end officers' residences. And we find them that is a child shoe, sort of maybe a 10 to 12-year-old, so child maybe moving into adolescent. We find them the little tiny baby's booty, if anyone has seen that at Vindolanda, that's also in this fishnet style. So I've argued that those children are being held to some sort of sartorial standard, some sort of fashion standard that is expected of them there, because we find them in the very large sizes as well. So the very smallest shoes in these elite spaces are mimicking the very largest shoes. So I find that really interesting. Arguably our nicest shoe was found also in the Praetorium. We call it the Lepidina slipper, which is exactly what archaeologists should not do. It's not a slipper, it's a sandal, but it gives us a very bad name, right? But it was found directly next to the letter where Lepidina's or where the other woman is oh, Lepidina, come to my birthday party. And it's really tempting. But I'm trying to move people away from us calling that. It can still be called that in the museum, fine. But that is arguably, it came out of the Praetorium. It is the nicest shoe on the whole site. It's got a maker's mark in it, Lucius Aebutius Thales. We have only 2 shoes that have a maker's mark in them. The other one has an exact parallel in York. So we do know that some of these things are moving around, that maybe these are sort of high-end, you know, our early Pradas and Jimmy Choos. But we wish we had more. Out of the entire assemblage, we have we have more that have stamps, just generic stamps like of rosettes and eagles and, you know, things like that, but 2 maker's marks out of all of them. So this isn't happening a lot, clearly. So I do think that there are styles that are reserved for, if I go back even further on this one, that are reserved for certain kinds of people. And we can also think to what we know about Rome and about the fact that in Rome, the color of shoes that you wore was actually legislated, right? The senators were allowed to wear those red boots, and equestrians wore the black boots, and et cetera, et cetera. And that's kind of important to think about, because they were actually saying that you are showing your status physically, quickly, easily, outwardly with your footwear and other things, gold rings, right? Gold rings for senators and silver rings for equestrians and stuff like that. So there are these other sartorial legislative pieces that suggest that they carry. Now, this is whoever I talked about. I talked about socks with some people out there in the reception. And I'm interested in socks, because if you wore a nice sock through some of these boots, like that one up there on the left, a nice bright red sock, it's actually going to show through. And are we actually seeing that status come through in this kind of footwear? Maybe, maybe not. But we can hypothesize, yeah. Did that answer your question? Yeah. Okay, cool. I can hear you. Can everybody else? Yeah.
And other people hear? Okay, I can hear it.
There we go,
now.
there we go.
Cool, cool. This actually dovetails directly into my question, which is that you mentioned with scanning, you're starting to see inscriptions and maker's marks and stamps kind of surfacing on the insoles. Are you seeing any unique inscriptions? I'm curious personally, in like personal ritual and amulets, and there are some shoes that have like good luck sayings that have come out of Rome and Egypt and leather, and I was just curious what like the breadth is.
Don't seem to have, I know, there are some really cool things and like cool things being done with the hobnails. We have cool hobnail patterns, but they're really just truly geometric patterns. There's nothing like follow me, you know, like none of those cool things. But we have one shoe that says Itati, I-T-A-T-I. Maybe a name, I don't know. And it's just sort of scratched in. So we do have some things. I have published the things that have stamps and whatnot. Carol Vander Murray published everything up to 1993. You can email me, I'll send you, I'll just send you PDFs. And then in her Festschrift, I published from 1993 up until 2018 or whenever that was. So you can see what's actually on all of those. I'd be happy to share it. Cool. Good. You can talk real loud, probably.
Yeah, I can just shout.
Oh, for the recording, yes, right. I always forget about the recording.
Testing again?
Yeah.
There we go. So I guess I had a kind of a question where when you discovered that the tent panels were like 100% sheep at a certain point, and you mentioned that also we're not recovering as many fibers now as we did in the past, but I was wondering if there was any parallels between like wool or like any like sheepskin use or like in the wattle and daub as like insulation and stuff like that to kind of correlate with that.
Yeah. So this is a great question, and really this is something that I'm not ready to talk about yet, but we are bringing together the textiles and the leather. Jillian and Barbara are working on the textiles quite extensively. They're both knitters, so they got into it, and I'm like, I don't know how to talk about textile stuff at all. Probably won't surprise Nick at all, I'm not a knitter. But this is a really interesting question because we also have leather with fur still on it. Not a lot. We have, of everything that I've looked at so far, we've got about like 10 or 12 pieces. So the three of us are going to triangulate this, and we have just found, so here's something interesting. I didn't mention this. I mentioned it very briefly in the beginning. We have no thread. So whatever the thread was made of, it does not survive in the anaerobic environments that preserves leather and so many other things. So we've been going back and forth about what this could be. It could be, I was moving away from sinew, because sinew is heavy, right? And you don't actually get a ton of sinew from each animal. The sinew is like the stuff, right, that goes down the leg. You know, that stuff. There's not a ton of sinew that comes out of each animal, so it's kind of the commodity is, although one of our writing tablets actually does say that I'm bringing a whole ton of sinew into the fort. So that's interesting. But then I recently saw sinew at the Bata Shoe Museum in Toronto. Oh, by the way, there's going to be a big exhibit at the Bata Shoe Museum, 18 months starting May 6th of 2026. 18 months it'll be there. Vindolanda shoes, like 50 or 60 of the Vindolanda shoes, interpretation, all sorts of cool stuff. And we're going to have a conference. So if anybody wants in on this, that's only a couple hours from here, right? Drive to Windsor, get the train into Toronto. Yeah, never come back. Just kidding. So I was visiting the Bata recently, and the sinew that they have there, I didn't realize that sinew can be made very, very, very small. So it's either sinew, or the thread could be goat skin. Or goat fur, I should say. So it could be a sort of textile, but it also could be like a flax or nettle, something like that. So actually, Barbara and Jillian just texted me 2 days ago, and they said, hey, we got this crazy microscope we have one piece where we finally found some thread. It's all mixed in with fur, but it is actually thread. We just found it this summer. And they think it's a combination of plant and fur. So it'll be like textile and plant. And what's so crazy is one of my really go-getter MA students found a written source, a text, from the Roman world. I can't remember what it is now. I should remember this. That actually says, this is how you do it. You mix together plant and goat. And you're like, what? So we have to really test that and really get that going. But you're absolutely onto something. I'm not ready to answer it yet, but that is a really interesting triangulation of evidence, for sure. Yeah.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Sure.
Do you know if, was any of the leather being tanned on site or nearby, or has any of that survived in the nearby area?
Tanning is such an interesting question as well. And that go-getter MA student, she's working on tanning, and she's going to continue into her PhD next year on tanning. So there is only one confirmed tannery in all of the Roman Empire. Did anyone know that? It's at Pompeii. There's a second at a place called Casal Bertone, right near Rome, and that is a potential. It's not been published yet. It's coming out, but although I just noticed that Christina Kilgrove works on this, so I was like, I have an in, because we've been trying to figure out who we could talk to about this space. Now, what my student is going to do is really look all over. There's got to be greater signatures of tanning. Maybe you don't have the entire thing. Vats are problematic. So there are all these places where people say, oh, that might have been happening there, but it's not definitive. So we're also hoping eventually that we can work on this as well. But isn't that crazy that there's only in the whole of the Roman Empire one confirmed tannery? And there it is in the center of the city of Pompeii. So it would stink to high heaven, this stuff. And we've always thought it would be out in these industrial zones and things. We do have one space that I excavated out in the North Field at Vindolanda, which is sort of away from everything, that we're going to start looking at for potential. Could we start suggesting that sort of thing was happening? But it is a problem. The elusive tanneries of the Roman world, it's a tough question. Yeah, I know.
Wonderful. And on that redolent note, I think we've gotten all the shoe content we could possibly get.
There's more. I promise.
But we should let her off the hook, but not before having thanked her again for coming.
Thank you so much. This is really great. I'm so glad to be here, and thank you so much for listening. Great.